Step into the dark alleys of 19th century Paris, where ambition meets corruption. In Balzac's Père Goriot, young Eugène de Rastignac arrives in Paris, full of hopes and dreams. But in a shabby boarding house, he meets Vautrin, a former convict with a sinister proposition. Vautrin lays it out starkly. Success through hard work and talent is an illusion. Instead, he paints a picture of a life mired in mediocrity and struggle. But there's an alternative. Marry for money, not love. Imagine this. Marry Victorine, another boarding house guest, and inherit a fortune, Vautrin suggests. But the catch? Her brother must die, and Vautrin is willing to arrange it. Rastignac, tempted but horrified, faces a moral crossroads. This is the brutal reality of Balzac's Paris, a society where money trumps morality. So, what would you choose? Success at any cost, or a life of integrity? Balzac leaves us pondering the price of ambition. This is why you need to think twice about hitting the books. Vautrin's lesson on inheritance versus hard work might surprise you. In 19th century France, Vautrin painted a stark picture. Wealth came from inheritance, not labor. Jane Austen's characters? Same story. Inherited wealth was the golden ticket. Think Scarlett O'Hara's suitors. They weren't banking on their degrees. But why was this the norm? And more importantly, has anything really changed? Post-World War II, work and study seemed the way to go. Meritocracy was the new mantra. But fast forward to today, and inequalities are creeping back. So, should you ditch your textbooks for a rich spouse or a hefty inheritance? Vautrin might say, yes, but remember, while his lesson might sound tempting, today's reality leans more towards hard work and talent. Intrigued? You need to watch this if you're baffled by income inequality. Let's simplify it together. Income inequality boils down to two big factors: labor and capital. Think of labor as the money you earn from working, like wages and salaries. Capital, on the other hand, is money made from owning things like property, stocks, or businesses. Now, these two can be unevenly distributed. Some people might have high income from labor but low from capital, or the other way around. The bigger the gap in each, the greater the overall inequality. What's wild is the relationship between the two. In some societies, those with high labor income also have high capital income, making inequality even worse. And here's the kicker. If folks with big fortunes get higher returns on their investments than everyone else, inequality skyrockets. So next time you hear about income inequality, remember, it's all about the mix of labor and capital. What I wish I knew about wealth inequality when I was in school? It's mind-blowing. First up, capital versus labor. Wealth from capital, like stocks and real estate, is always more unequally distributed than income from labor, like wages. Here's the kicker. In every country and every era, the top 10% of labor earners get about 25 to 30% of total labor income. Meanwhile, the top 10% of capital owners control over 50% of all wealth, sometimes even up to 90%. And the bottom 50%? They earn a significant share of labor income but own almost none of the wealth. Why? Because wealth isn't just about saving for a rainy day or retirement. It's heavily influenced by inheritance, and the snowball effect of existing assets. So, while wage inequality might seem reasonable, wealth inequality is always extreme. And that's the stark reality. Why aren't more people talking about the real impact of inequality? Let's break it down. In the most egalitarian societies, like Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s, the top 10% earned about 20% of total wages. The bottom 50%? They took home 35%, and the middle 40%? They got around 45% of the total income. Now, imagine the average pay is €2,000 a month. The top 10% would earn €4,000. The bottom 50% would get 1,400, and the middle 40% would make roughly 2,250. These numbers paint a picture, not of perfect equality, but of a distribution that's relatively balanced. But what happens when we shift to capital ownership? Even in these egalitarian societies, the gap widens significantly. Understanding these numbers helps us grasp the real impact of inequality on our daily lives. Are you curious about which social class you belong to? Let's uncover the truth about lower, middle, and upper classes. The lower class makes up the bottom 50% of the population. These are individuals and families earning the least. The middle class represents the middle 40%. They often have stable incomes, own homes, and can afford some luxuries. But they're not rolling in it. Finally, the upper class is the top 10%. These folks have significant wealth and resources, often influencing society and politics. Remember, these labels are arbitrary and can be debated, but they help us understand economic divisions. Wait! Is it class or centile? Let's dive in. Alright, so picture this. Different societies, different eras, but inequality is always there. In one corner, we have class. Peasants versus nobles, workers versus managers. Familiar, right? But here's the twist. Deciles and centiles. Deciles split the population into 10 groups, centiles into 100. Boring? Maybe. Useful? Absolutely. Why? Because whether it's France in 1789 or the US in 2011, these numbers help us compare apples to apples. Ever heard of the 1%? That's the upper centile, and it's a game changer in understanding who holds the power and wealth. So, next time someone mentions inequality, think both class and centiles. I'm sure you've heard the news. Income inequality is on the rise. But what does that really mean? Inequality in labour income isn't just about numbers, it's about real lives. In the most equal countries like 1970s Scandinavia, the top 10% earned 20% of total wages, while the bottom 50% got 35%. Not bad, right? But in countries like the US today, the top 10% take home 35% and the bottom half just 25%. That's a huge shift. Imagine earning €1,400 a month instead of €1,000. That's 40% more for housing, vacations, and life's little joys. So, what's the takeaway? Public policies matter. If you think wage gaps are a big deal, wait till you hear about wealth gaps. Let's dive into the shocking world of wealth inequality. In some of the most equal societies, like Scandinavia in the 1980s, the richest 10% owned over 50% of the wealth. Fast forward to the 2010s, and in countries like France and Germany, that number jumps to 60%. In the US, it's even more extreme. The top 10% hold a whopping 72% of the wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 50%? They own less than 5%, often closer to 2%. Imagine a society where average net wealth is €200,000 per adult. For the poorest half, that's just €20,000 each. For the richest 10%, it averages €1.2 million each. Ever wonder how the middle class got their slice of the wealth pie? In the early 1900s, Europe was a place where the richest 10% owned nearly all the wealth. The top 1% alone held more than half. The middle 40%? Barely better off than the bottom 50%. But then something amazing happened. The patrimonial middle class emerged. This shift meant more people owned property, though still far from the top dogs. By the end of the 20th century, the wealthiest 1% saw their share drop to about 20 to 25%. The middle class grabbed a bigger chunk of the pie, owning around a third of Europe's wealth. Sure, wealth inequality is still a thing, but this change reshaped society and politics. If you think income inequality is just a buzzword, think again. It's a tale of two worlds. Let's break it down. Income inequality isn't just about who makes more money from their job. It's about the total income from both work and investments. In the 1970s and 80s, the top 10% in Scandinavia earned about 25% of the national income. Today, in countries like the US, that figure can be over 35%. Now, picture this. In the most unequal societies, the top 10% can rake in half of the national income. And if it ever hit 90%, well, a revolution might not be far behind. So, what's the takeaway? Whether through inherited wealth or high-paying jobs, extreme inequality shapes our world. Why aren't more people talking about how misleading synthetic indices can be? The Gini coefficient is often used to measure inequality, but it's not as straightforward as it seems. It simplifies complex social realities into a single number, making it seem like inequality can be easily understood. But here's the catch. Inequality at different levels of society can't be captured by one number. The Gini coefficient mixes labour and capital inequalities, even though they stem from completely different economic mechanisms. Instead, we should look at distribution tables. They show us the real cash terms, revealing the true social and economic disparities. In short, synthetic indices like the Gini coefficient give an abstract view of inequality, often missing the nuances. Why do 90% of official reports on inequality miss the mark? Let's break it down. Official statistics often use the P9/P10 ratio to measure inequality. That's the income of the top 10% compared to the bottom 10%. Seems straightforward, right? But here's the kicker. This ratio ignores everyone above the 90th percentile. Imagine ignoring the wealthiest folks in a report on inequality. This can paint a misleading picture. For instance, the top 10% might hold 20% of total income in one country but 90% in another. Yet the P90-P10 ratio doesn't tell us this. You need to watch this if you struggle with understanding wealth distribution. Let's dive into social tables and political arithmetic. Imagine a world where we didn't just use synthetic indices or Gini coefficients to study wealth distribution. Social tables and political arithmetic offer a richer view. These tools were first developed in the 17th century by pioneers like Gregory King. They aim to give a comprehensive vision of society, showing income and wealth across different groups. Fast forward to today, where national accounts let us measure income and wealth annually. But what if we could break these down by decile and centile? It would reveal how much of the wealth growth reaches the poorest 50%, the middle 40%, and the richest 10%. Such detailed breakdowns would highlight whether growth benefits all or just the elite.